Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Three Guys and an iPad, the proverbial water cooler of the mortgage and real estate industry. I am one of those three guys, Brian Rieger with Content Beacon and True Impact Communications. But of course, we wouldn't be three guys without our other two regulars. First of all, you know him well and love him more. It's Rick Grant of RGA PR and Content Beacon. Rick, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here, Brian. Good to see you.
And Mr. Kevin Breeland, live from Austin, Texas. He's with Amplify Credit Union, and he is also a past president of Respro. Kevin, how are you holding up these days?
I'm doing great, Brian.
Outstanding. And are you on your, it looks like you're on the back porch today.
I'm on the back porch sitting in my rocking chair.
Outstanding. Continuity from episode to episode. I love it, Kevin. I love it. All right, we're not going to take too much time with us today because we've got not one but two special guests, and I'm going to introduce them to you right now. Our first guest is Charles Cain. He's an executive vice president with WFG National Title Insurance Company. He's coming to us, I believe, from Cincinnati, Ohio. Chuck, how are you today? It's good to see you.
I am well and maintaining social distancing, and the only time I leave my zip code is to go to a liquor store in Kentucky.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Well, it's good to hear. I've heard it's the other way up here. The folks from Pennsylvania are sneaking into Ohio to buy the liquor. So
it is a resurgence of the Youngstown economy.
Well, in keeping with the nature of the quarantine, I've started making my own. And on that note, let's move over to our other very special guest, the Honorable Joseph Murin. Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing well, thanks. I like Chuck's comment, though. I may have to sneak into Ohio to buy my booze because we can't get it here in Pennsylvania, that's for sure.
Joe, we'll send you a bottle of whatever you like on Three Guys and an iPad. You just let me know what you're looking for, and we will take care of you. Or I can send some of my very own stuff if you'd like.
Oh, jeez.
That's the appropriate response, yes. And
he has a ladle next to the bathtub where he's making it.
Hey, but we did clean the bathtub before this all got started, so it's okay.
Good.
And of course, if you've been living under a rock for the last 20 years, you won't know this, but Joe is the past president of Ginnie Mae from 2008 through 2009. He's currently a chairman emeritus of Chrysalis Holdings, and he's the chairman of JJAM Financial Services. And again, Joe, it's a pleasure to have you here. And we're looking forward to talking with you.
My pleasure. I enjoy it.
All right. And I'm going to take half a second to do our show's shameless plug for Content Beacon. That's the industry's only B2B content marketing agency. And I'd like, Rick and I would both like to thank those of you who have been reaching out to us the last couple of weeks. It's nice to know that not just our parents are watching. And we'll be having other special guests. And if we're lucky, we'll have Joe and Chuck back again, if they'll have us. But if you do have ideas to share or you'd like to be on the show, just email me at brian@contentbeacon.com or rick@contentbeacon.com. All right, I've already taken up too much of this segment. So, Joe, we're going to start with you. We're going to dive into what everyone's talking about, if you don't mind.
Sure.
If folks don't know already, FHFA Director Mark Calabria for weeks has been insisting that there's no need for the GSEs to provide any financial backstop for mortgage servicers beset by an increase in forbearances. Now, we've had other folks like thought leaders David Stevens or trade organizations like the MBA who've come out very strongly demanding more support for those servicers. I'll also note, especially having Joe here, that we have seen Ginnie Mae step up in several ways to support their servicers, and we'll come into that in a little bit too. But let's jump right into the fray with a man who knows it inside and out. And Chuck Cain, I'm going to invite you to jump in as well after we talk with Joe. So just on April 21st, and we're recording this on the 22nd since news is coming so fast, FHFA announced some new action. And now they're not going to be setting up a liquidity facility, not that they ever were. However, they are announcing the change to GSE policy, limiting the number of payments that servicers will be required to make to investors to 4 months. And the news keeps coming, but let's start with that. Joe, is this enough?
I don't think it's going to be enough. I think it's all going to depend on what the percentage of these foreclosures take on. But, you got to go back and understand that, the director of FHFA, I think it's always been his desire to eliminate the non-depositories from the servicing game and put it in the hands of the banks, for no other reason than, as an economist, he looks at the logic that an economist would look at and say, oh, well, they're depositories. They have the wherewithal. Let's push everything into their hands. And, I guess that's the way an economist thinks. But ultimately, I think that the banks don't have a desire for that. I don't think they have a desire for the servicing like they might have at one time before. So I think he made he came out a couple weeks ago and says, we're not doing anything. And oh, by the way, I think I read where he said, it might get to 1 or 2%. Well, it's beyond that now. It's probably north of 6% from what I understand. And it's only going to get worse. And a lot of these folks are not going to be able to handle just the 4 payments. They're going to need some liquidity facilities put up. So, because can you imagine what would happen in an event like this? Can you imagine the devastation it's going to be to the industry if he tries to eliminate all the non-depositories through defaults because they're not liquid enough to handle what's happened through this pandemic issue? I mean, and obviously there are folks on the Hill who in their jurisdictions are going to get a lot of blowback, so they're not happy about this. And I really do think that Secretary Mnuchin, I mean, he understands the mortgage industry very well. He's very astute about the mortgage industry, and it's one of the reasons why when he first came out, when this all started, and said this is a necessary function in our marketplace, leave these people alone. Even though some of the governors have decided that it's not, Mnuchin at least said, yeah, we've got to have the housing and mortgage industry working through this pandemic period. I think that ultimately they're going to come through, depending on how far this goes and what the percentage is. But ultimately, I think the director kind of shot his wad too soon, and maybe in fact didn't have the total authority to make that kind of decision on behalf of the industry by saying, well, we'll just push. I mean, he was so. Did you listen to what he said? Oh, look, if they go into default, we'll just take it up and give it to all the servicers. I mean, you're talking about someone who never spent a minute's time in our industry to make a statement like that, thinking, oh, that's no big deal. We'll just push them off to the banks. And that just blew me away. But anyway, at least there's a first step, and I'm happy that there's a first step, but I think they're going to have to put a facility in place.
Outstanding. And, Joe, of course, you were the president at Ginnie during a volatile time as well. You were there kind of as we were getting underway with the economic meltdown, and you were a very active leader at Ginnie, did quite a bit to inject liquidity into the housing market. So I want to ask if you're comfortable. Tell us about what you see Ginnie Mae doing right now, and maybe what you think they should be doing, or so forth. What's their role?
Well, the good news is that I think Chapter 34, Section D of their policies and procedures gives them the authority to do the PTAP program. I mean, the Stafford Act gave them the authority back in, I think, 1988 to be able to come up. But I give Seth Appleton and his crew a lot of kudos for making it happen as quickly as they did, getting it out. Now, I got to tell you, when you read it, you got to be in dire needs to take advantage of this program, because there's a hell of a lot of restrictions that come with it. So, but I'm happy that it's there, and I think they did it. They did a great job in getting it out. But there's a huge but here. 74% of the $2 trillion portfolio are issuers of non-depository nature. That's an incredible amount of risk. That's an incredible amount of risk in times like this, but also in times of a recession. So, when they approve issuers, there's a whole process they go through for months and months and months. And they always look at the equity of their balance sheet. But that equity, a lot of times, equity is not liquid. It's all about the liquidity of the issuer. So they need to do two things. Number one, they need to be able to address the acknowledgement so that lenders are willing to lend on MSRs, so that there's a facility in place in case something happens. This has been going on since I was there. That they tweak it and they tweak it, but it's still not, it doesn't meet lenders and give them comfort to be able to put money out against MSRs, whether they're putting it out at 50% of value or 70% of value, doesn't really matter. They don't feel comfortable with it. The second thing they have to do is they have to create and establish a capital liquid test. Don't put non-depositories as an issuer if they don't have the liquidity. As a matter of fact, I went to Ginnie in 2015 and said, guys, you need to think about not allowing these non-depositories to maintain MSRs until such time that they have a liquidity base that's meaningful. I mean, you get a guy with a $1 million value on his balance sheet, an equity position on his balance sheet, and they're out there, storing MSRs like nuts for the winter. It doesn't work that way. And, it never really transpired. And, I got, yeah, thank you very much. But the problem we have, and I don't want to be long-winded about this, but the problem we have right now is that our industry never thinks about the what ifs. What if something could happen? What if this happened? What if that happens? And they never prepare themselves. I've said this for the 48 years I've been in this business. I know mortgage bankers really well. And mortgage bankers are either too busy or too sad. One or the other. They never really spend the time to run their business and I'm not saying that all of them, I'm just saying there's a huge majority of ones, especially the ones that have come on since 2000 when the refi mania started and has never left us basically since the year 2001. So if you've never come on and had to really build a business because it was just coming in the front door with the hiatus being in maybe late 27 and 28, 2008, you really never had to step back and say, hey, what do I got to do to maintain liquidity, prepare for the unexpected? And I think that's something that we got to get back to because it's a problem in a market as big and as dangerous as the mortgage industry is today.
Well said, Joe. And of course, I've been along with you for part of that ride, the tail end of the ride, and I've seen you out there quite a bit speaking to some of these issues. It's not the first time we've heard this from you. You've been pretty straightforward about it throughout, and now here we are. I've got more questions for you, but if you don't mind, I'm going to open you up to our peanut gallery a little bit here, including our friend Chuck Cain. Do you guys have anything you'd like to ask on this point before we move on, or anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'll just jump in, Brian, and thanks for having me on. And I couldn't agree with Joe more on this topic. It reminds me of a comment that was made to me in the mid-'90s by someone who is still at Freddie Mac, so I won't mention them by name. But the comment there from this person was, well, at Freddie, something's not a problem till it's a problem. And I think when Joe talks about the foreseeability and about people in the mortgage industry not thinking beyond the end of the month, that it is troubling, and we've all seen it in different grades. But yeah, I couldn't agree more with what he has said, and I find it very strange too that in recent reports out of the media that the two people who seem to be talking about some sort of credit facility for mortgage servicing or mortgage servicers is Maxine Waters and Sherrod Brown. what a strange, wild trip we are on. When those are the two people who are talking about it. I'm sure they'll find a way later to penalize everybody, but that's just my offhand comment.
The opinions reflected by Chuck Cain do not necessarily reflect those of you. Now, great point, Chuck.
Of anybody, especially my wife.
True.
Kevin, Rick, before we move on, anything you wanted to add, or did you want to ask anything of our guests on this point?
Just one question, Joe. If you were asked to advise the FHFA, what would be the quick bullet points you would ask them to consider right now?
I would think they have to have a capital test of the non-depositories. I think they really need to go in and look at the non-depositories and evaluate them, their balance sheets and so forth, and have requirements on, look, if you're going to maintain to be an approved servicer of Fannie and Freddie, you really have to have liquidity or availability of liquidity for a crisis like this. And look, if they've done it to the banks in 2008 and 2009 with the capital test, anybody that's in a position that can fail because of the business they're in on something that's unexpected, whether it's recession or whether it's a pandemic or whatever, should have to ascertain a certain level of liquidity with their business to get through. So I think that has to happen. And again, too little, too late, but going forward, there's no reason why they can't do this.
Well, I'm going to ask another question here, and Joe, I'm going to ask you first, and then I'd like to hear other folks as well. What happens next with the servicer story? How does this end?
I think it's going to kind of, I'm hoping it's going to end in a stalemate here, that we're going to get through it. And the thing about it is, we're going back to the previous question, once it's done, it can't be over. It can't be, okay, we're just going to kick the can down the road and we're just going to continue like it's never going to happen again, because it will happen again. And so something has to happen. And now's not the time for it. The time for this is when the market settles down, this pandemic, they've got their hands around this pandemic, and we come back to the table and say, okay, guys, we can't go through this again. What are we going to do? And if they do that, then I think they're being prudent about looking forward and asking themselves the what if questions. I'm going to tell you right now that I doubt that there were a handful of folks in the industry that were ready for a pandemic.
Maybe not just this industry.
And now there are some that, like my previous company where we had a SOC, they require you to have a pandemic policy.
Okay.
Now, just because you have a written pandemic policy doesn't mean that you actually have a pandemic structure in place. You just have a policy in place. But I'll guarantee you that very, very few, if any, had a pandemic policy that was absolutely supported by an infrastructure that could support that. Well, people were scrambling.
That's interesting, Joe, you say that. And for the peanut gallery and for Chuck, I'm going to come back to you and ask how this ends, but I want to keep going with this a second. Joe, one of the next questions I was going to ask you was really, you mentioned this is bigger in some ways for the industry. It's not just the pandemic. It's a short-term outlook at things, a short-term approach. Let's admit that the mortgage industry, like it or not, is changing right now as we speak, even if it's temporary. So I'm going to ask you to get even bigger than the pandemic or whatnot. What carries through in the mortgage industry after we're no longer talking about COVID, after there's a vaccine or it's under control or whatnot? And we could be talking years. But do you think anything comes through this and carries through to be a permanent change for the mortgage industry?
Well, I think it's crazy to keep doing the same thing over and over again. And so much of the industry, and if you read things that come across and depend on that are out there, you would think we are the most technically proficient industry in the world, but we're not. No. Because we're just not. Because most people don't adhere to that, and somebody comes out with a whiz bang thing, and it's really about it's a it's a very, very small piece of what something could happen. And so you can't piece it all together and have a flow of business that works. We need to figure out how to do things faster and better, more efficient than we have before. We have to take the risk out of doing business in the mortgage industry. I mean, you know how many folks got margin calls 3 or 4 weeks ago? A ton of people were sitting down every night praying that this thing wasn't going to take them down, just because they're hedged out too far. You know, there's no reason in God's green acres that a refi can't close within 15 days of the application. There's no reason. But I will tell you, the vast majority of folks in our industry only think about one thing: sales. They really don't, you know, once the sale is done, the application's in, most CEOs don't even look at the back end of the business, the back room. They just don't. They never have. They just never have. But that's really where the nuts and bolts of this thing comes together. I hope for a fact that we really take on a posture of really trying to understand risk. Not just hedging risk, not just pipeline risk, but risk. And if we can come out of that understanding, you know what? In a nanosecond, we could have lost everything 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we're still not out of the woods. Oh. But in a nanosecond, that could have happened. And I don't think the vast majority of folks were prepared for it at all. Really? So that to me is the issue that I hope that there's a lot of change, and not just a lot of blustering. I mean, real change that comes to fruition once this is all done.
And this does tend to be an industry that resists change, Joe. I would agree with that.
Very much so. Very much so.
Now I'm going to come back to the peanut gallery, and Joe, feel free to jump in the midst of this too. We'll start with you, Chuck, but Rick and Kevin jump in as well. Let's come back a little bit. How does this story end? And I know I asked you guys this question last week, but 1 week makes a hell of a difference these days, doesn't it? So I'm going to ask you guys, all three of you, how does the story end, and what do you think pulls through, if anything, from the dramatic temporary changes we're dealing with right now?
Well, I'll say from the title and settlement side, where does the story all end? Well, I don't know that any of us really completely see where this could be. I mean, we could see gradual easings of the restrictions in the economy here. Obviously, in some states, they're doing them now. But we could see some of those easings. We'll see whether pent-up demand versus consumer confidence, how those two things balance out. But from title and settlement, I would say that, and in keeping with what you and Joe were discussing, title and settlement particularly, will never be exactly the same. The movement towards remote online notary, which has not been the seismic shift that a lot of people, or if you read the trades, has happened. We have a lot of states who can do remote online notary. We have executive orders, some of which may be problematical as to even whether the governor or administrator had the authority to issue these orders. That's another issue for us in the title insurance industry. It's like, well, that's all great, but 3 years from now, when these loans go in the tank, or worst case, 6 months from now, they go in the tank, will the bankruptcy judge buy that story? And what bag are we left holding with in the title insurance industry?
I agree with that.
And so we've seen now, we have acronyms of RIN, we have Avon, as in Avon calling, I guess, that different types of what I would refer to from my generation as Rube Goldberg ideas about how to do some of these things, where we're going to have a limited power of attorney executed via remote online notary simultaneously with wet signings of documents where once the Ron execution of the LPOA transpires, then we're going to continue on with a wet signing of documents where the online notary will simply witness someone signing something which I guess are the original loan documents. They will then be transported, and then the notary will affix their signature and seal. This to me is like two tin cans tied together with string. But we see lenders driving towards this. I think we will see some significant changes in regard to e-closing as versus Ron. But there was MBA had a webinar 2 days ago where someone from Simplifile came on and said, well, and I think they're pretty knowledgeable because they're in the front lines of getting recordings done. And they said, our statistic shows that in states where Ron is enabled and where it is functional, that in those states, 13% of the jurisdictions in those states won't take a Ron document on demand.
Right.
And so, again, and to Joe's point, where, there's, you read in the trades, it's like, oh, well, technology and, we can do all these things and it's wonderful. We're still in the settlement industry, we're still tied to an awful lot of laws that date back to the 17th and 18th century about how these things happen. One concern I think that we have generally in the industry is we've seen loosenings, all changes as to policies, what Fannie and Freddie have said that they will accept. Are those going to remain in place? I mean, there's a lot of talk about use of limited powers of attorney. Powers of attorney, generally speaking, have been a problem in our industry because they lend themselves to a lot of fraud. A lot of issues come up with powers of attorney about that are being denied and who signed. They've been around forever. We were doing LPOAs under certain transactions going back to the 1980s. But to make that sort of a hallmark, that's a real slippery slope. And again, presuming we're all in business 2 and 3 and 4 years from now, and will those bankruptcy judges, will those judges in state courts, will they look back at this and it's like, you guys pushed the envelope too hard. I'm letting this guy off. He swears he didn't sign this.
Right.
And what you have really isn't very good. So, I think that's a concern we have about as far as the I'll say retrograde of some principles of our business from the lending side. And just because, as I reminded one of our agents, because a lender says that we'll take this, that's acceptable, it's like, well, that doesn't mean it follows state law. And it does. And if a lender compels you to follow a certain function, if you want to keep their business, said, get it in writing. Because what they may find out is that if that loan goes in the tank and they have to exercise the title insurance policy, that they're not insured, because title insurance does not insure you against things you know about or create. And if you mandate a certain thing to happen, and that title agent and agency agreements throughout the title insurance world specifically exclude escrow and settlement. That's pretty much true throughout the industry. So a policy issuing agent for us, they're authorized to issue title insurance. In most jurisdictions, they're probably doing settlement, but that's carved out. And so, it's a great concern as to the number of things that have eroded. And the other day when I saw the FAQs that came from Freddie, where they said, well, if the notary is, and the word they used was comfortable in doing certain practices. Now, when I was in law school, it's like, I don't think comfortable ever came up as a legal term. I guess that's somewhere between nonchalant and blasé. But that is a concern I've got, is that there's this rush to try to deal with this slug of refinances, to try to get them closed, keep commerce going. And has there been an erosion in regard to our due diligence from the settlement side? and how much of that erosion is going to stick around? And I don't know the answer. Joe may know or have a feel for it, especially in regard to Fannie and Freddie, how temporary some of these things may be, or whether they're going to be things like, it worked out pretty well. Let's just keep it.
Well, Chuck, the scare right now is that, oh my God, I'm a lender, and oh my God, my borrower doesn't want to meet an attorney or doesn't want to meet a notary. I can tell you, I sold my title business in January, and my daughters still work there, and they're closing probably $800 a month or so. They've never had one blowback from a borrower that didn't want to close the loan.
Right.
And now the lenders are trying to change the paradigm. Well, we're only going to have so many documents signed. Does a notary really have to witness the document? This is the kind of craziness that comes up, which goes to Chuck's point. Title insurance is only available for the title. It's not available for the escrow screw-up or the settlement screw-up. So, you've got to remind your clients, look, if you want me to do this, give it to me in writing, but you got to understand, it's not insured by that title underwriter if you screw up. And they hold it over your head like the sword of Damocles, right? Well, all your other competitors are doing it. Well, damn well that's not true, but they got to tell you that anyway, from their perspective to get you to do it. And this is what goes on day in and day out in the industry, which really tells you, and I don't think, Chuck, it's changed in, I've been doing this for over almost 5 decades. I don't think none of that crap has changed from the arm twisting that lenders give you on a day-to-day basis, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
Well, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here, and we're going to do something I've always wanted to do. And we have some breaking news. Okay, now I'll remind those viewers, whenever it is that you're watching this, we're recording this on April 22nd, so it won't be breaking by the time you see it. And I would also caution viewers to realize that these are first reactions. There may be more nuance to this. And maybe you guys did see this come across the transom just before we started recording. But if you will, I'm going to read this to you, and you let me know if you want to respond. This is out of DS News, and the headline is, GSEs will purchase qualified loans in forbearance. I'm just going to read the first 2 short paragraphs and see if you guys want to respond, and I'll understand, this is new stuff. You'll want to see the whole story, but, just to kind of play along with the infotainment networks and everything, and maybe Rick can gin up a crawl for us or something on the bottom of our screen. But let me read this out to you guys. And I will say, Joe and Rick, it came in just before you logged on, so I emailed it to you if you're able to pull it up conveniently. If not, let me read the first couple paragraphs. So the FHFA has announced that it is approving the purchase of certain single-family mortgages in forbearance that meet specific eligibility criteria by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the enterprises. Now I'm quoting Director Mark Calabria of the FHFA. We are focused on keeping the mortgage market working for current and future homeowners during these challenging times. Purchases of these previously ineligible loans will help provide liquidity to mortgage markets and allow originators to keep lending. And again, this is from DS News. That's the first one I've gotten on this. Now, there's probably a lot more, so it's a little dangerous, but since we're having kind of a freewheeling discussion, does anyone want to comment on that?
I was under the impression that they couldn't purchase loans in forbearance out of the pools. Okay. I was under the impression it's not like they're 120 days delinquent and I'm going to purchase out of the pool. I'm going to buy it out of the pool, right? These are forbearance loans that go 4 payments. I was under the impression they weren't going to purchase them out of the pool. They were just going to take the loan back, if you will. So I'm not sure that I understand fully what they're doing, but I was under the impression that they weren't taking forbearance loans out of the pools.
All right. Let me read the third paragraph, Joe, and let's see if that clarifies it a little more. And again, I understand you're literally getting hit with the headline, so it could be a little dangerous. So, but the third paragraph, and I'm quoting DS News again, Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, some borrowers have sought payment forbearance shortly after closing on their single-family loan and before the lender could deliver the mortgage loan to the GSEs. Mortgage loans either in forbearance or delinquent are ineligible for delivery under enterprise requirements. However, today's action lifts that restriction for a limited period of time and only for mortgages meeting certain eligibility criteria. There's the devil in the details, right? Eligible loans will also be priced to mitigate the heightened risk of loss to the enterprises from these loans. These prudential measures also ensure fulfillment of the enterprise's charter requirements to only purchase loans that meet the purchase standards imposed by private institutions.
Okay, this is up front then.
Yeah, so
They're talking about before they're pulled. They're talking about before they're.
okay.
Yeah, okay, I got it.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's pretty consistent with what you were saying then.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask again. Is this enough? Is this another good step?
It's another step, but look. If I want to save face because I think I might have stepped in it, then I'm not going to come back. I'm going to piecemeal myself through the process. Okay, instead of saying one big leap to liquidity, I'm going to piecemeal my steps through the process. So I think this is just another step to try to pacify what. Look, if I thought that there was only going to be forbearance levels of 1% to 2%, I can make a bold statement. But ultimately, if we're 6 and climbing, that's a lot. Okay, so. Are you going to still stand there and say, oh, not a problem? Because let's just say it goes to 10%, and let's just say there's no liquidity, and let's just say that there's a number of non-depository type servicers that can't make it work. Do you think for 1 minute that they're just going to back the truck up to some bank's door and dump this stuff on their lap?
Be quite a visual.
And by the way, I was in office when Bank of America bought Countrywide, and I remember what happened when Bank of America tried to take over Countrywide with bankers in place. It didn't work. It just didn't work. So, I'm not saying the banks won't take it, but it's going to be a methodical process for them to be willing to do it. You're going to have to give up something for them to do it, and it's going to take them time before they're willing to do it. So what happens to all those, what happens to everything in the interim period of time? They can't afford to allow these non-depository servicers to default. Going forward, post-pandemic, they certainly can afford them to become liquid under some sort of capital structure. That I agree with. But beforehand, they'd lose their minds if that happened. So,
yeah, this doesn't, Brian. This news doesn't look like it really has anything to do with the servicer crisis we've been talking about.
no.
And I know I'm just an industry observer, but if I was still reporting and wrote this story or got access to this story, I'd be saying, wait a minute. So you're going to go out to mid-tier and smaller community banks and credit unions that own their loans and service them themselves, that now find out that due to a government law they had nothing to do with, they have to give forbearance to their borrowers, and you're just going to take those loans and invest in them and act like you're doing everybody a favor.
Right. That's what it sounds like to me now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Chuck?
Yeah.
Chuck, Kevin?
I'll let Kevin take this one.
Well, I go back to something Rick said a few weeks ago. One of the things that makes me nervous is when the government says they're here to help. And I believe that the forbearance issue, the CARES Act, all of these things that we're talking about today and how it affects the non-bank servicers, the reality of it is I completely agree with Joe. We have them. Now's not the time for them to belly up and liquidate because it creates even more chaos in the market. especially if you're a borrower who is making your payments and not in forbearance, who you send it to, and then you find yourself into a negative situation on your credit report that you can't do anything to change. So I think Fannie and Freddie have no choice but to step up and cover these payments. I don't think the 4 months, I think the 4 months is way too long when you consider a servicer, say the size of Quicken Loans. Just how much money are we talking about? I've been trying to do the math on that and try to get a feel for what those portfolios look like. And that information is next to impossible to even find. But it has to be into the billions. And while I think those organizations are well-run organizations with good leadership, I don't think they have $10 billion laying around with nothing to do. So, that's where the problem is. And you have to get through this period. You have to come up with a plan on how recapitalization or capital test needs to look going into the future. Non-bank lenders became servicers to step in for an area where the banks stepped back in 2007, 2008, 2009. We do need to have them in the market, but what we're realizing now is this 60, 65, 70% penetration that they've put in and taken over the last 10 years, what that now looks like. They don't have enough money to cover these types of issues. Does anybody? Well, unless you're Chase or Citi, probably not. But the reality of it is, I don't think a pandemic would have put some of these servicers in this position to begin with. I think it could have been something on a much smaller level that we could have seen this happen again. And at some point in time, let's all be real. I've been doing this for 41 years. Joe's been doing it for almost 50. All of us on this call have been in this business a long time. We know at some point in time, housing prices will fall. It is a given fact. They will fall. The consumer will reach a point where $600,000 for a 900 square foot home is not in my wheelhouse. I'm okay with 400. I'm not okay with 600. And we'll see a retraction of the market simply because of that. Now, my question would be, what if that is the result of this? What if we now start seeing a falling in values because people have lost their job? We have somewhere around 10, 11, 12% unemployment. We've already incurred that probably only 95% of the 100% that were unemployed are going to go back to work. So I think we have the makings for not a recession, but a retraction in pricing. Low interest rates will help keep the market moving along. But if you start having a retraction in sales price and you have a file that's in forbearance and that house is now, let's say, worth $5,000 less than it was just 4 months ago, now what do you have?
One thing I'll say too, because we're talking about, how much does all this cost? And I was on a Black Knight webinar a couple of weeks ago, and maybe say Joe or Kevin or maybe some of you guys were on it, but they were talking about that if a default rate went to 8% in the United States, that to bail out the mortgage servicers would cost $42 billion a month.
Wow.
That's a big number.
Yeah, and as Everett Dirksen said, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. This is, and each day is so dramatically different. I'll just sign off saying that I think back to like Valentine's Day of this year, and Valentine's Day I think was somewhere during the Clinton administration in the 1990s. It seems like it was that long ago. As to how things have moved forward. I'm still waiting for Kevin Breeland to shoot me those barrels of oil I bought from him yesterday, and you still owe me $30 for each one you're sending.
All right. Well, we've got a lot of good stuff here. I've got one more question for our special guest, Joe, and then maybe the Peanut Gallery would like to weigh in. A lot of interesting stuff happening. Obviously, this story's got a long way to go, but let me ask a hypothetical of you, Joe. And I'll also note when you come in that you've got that you're going to join the hat wearers in the group. So I want you to explain that to us too. But is there a tipping point? Is there a point where the FHFA or the federal government in general hasn't done enough? Where is there like a point of no return or a point where the damage grows exponentially?
No. They'll write checks.
All right.
They have to. They have to. They don't have a choice. I mean, again, being in the thick of it in 2008 and 2009, watching what was going on with everything that was going on outside, within the Ginnie Mae, outside the Ginnie Mae in the federal government, I mean, the Treasury, they can't afford to let the housing industry crash. It's just not going to happen. I mean, they'll bob and weave and they'll do all the things that they're doing. But when you can just write checks, like, look, the CARES Act, they wrote a check, right? This subsequent, they're going to write a check. And they'll write a check, and they'll write a check, and they'll write a check. The problem is, at some point in time, my grandkids are going to be burdened with the checks that they're writing today. And that's a fact. So, but I don't think it's, again, as an industry, to still align, it's too big to fail. And when you're 12, we used to be all in about 17 to 19% of GDP. Housing, mortgages, the whole, I think it's down to 12%, something like that. That's still a big number as it relates to GDP. They can't really afford to allow an industry that big to go flat on its back. So I just think it's a lot of posturing now, a lot of wishful thinking on some parts, but they're not going to let this industry go in the tank. They're just not going to let it happen.
And Joe, I do notice that we've changed our headgear a little bit here. Are you a Vautech guy, I take it?
I played there, yeah. I played football for Virginia Tech. Yeah.
Outstanding. Hold on a second. They're just cleaning my Ohio State national championship football here.
Oh, now you're going to throw a national championship ball at me.
Does that thing still have air in it?
Yeah. Does it have?
It doesn't, Kevin.
Does it? Okay. I thought maybe.
What is it? 100 years old or?
Well, and now let me ask to the peanut gallery. What about you guys? Do you think is there a tipping point here where it's too late, where the FHFA, where they can't, we've already lost too much time?
Kevin, I'll jump in on that first. No, Joe, I'm going to make sure my wife watches this show because this is what I've been telling her, and now she may think that I'm a little smarter because someone like you is saying this too. The risk to the overall economy is relatively low because, Joe, they're never going to let it fail. Now, the risk to the individual players in the industry today is very high.
Different story.
Yeah, because when the dust clears, there will be a whole new set of players in some areas. And if the news we saw today is any indication of what's going to come, then we're going to see a lot of big players positioning to own these assets when the dust clears. And that could give us a whole different industry. But in the long term, Brian, the industry is doing what it always does. It waits for a crisis, and then it responds to that crisis like good risk mitigation professionals. And I think overall, they're doing a good job. I don't like seeing warehouse lenders, tighten that hose down any more than anybody else does, but that's what they have to do in a situation like this. We're going to see more of that before it gets better.
Mm-hmm.
Kevin, what do you think?
And there's no way that on a podcast I'm going to go against what Joe says, so I'm in total agreement. But at the same time, I'm going to add this bit. I do agree with Joe, and I do agree with Rick that the players are going to change, and that when this is all said and done, that's going to look a lot different. What I also hope will come out of it, though, and I was a proponent of this back in 2007 to 10, a lot of the committees and boards and everything that I would serve on when I would go to Washington, D.C. when I was invited. The industry itself, we have to do, and once again, we're at that same doorway. We have to do a much better job at policing ourselves. And here, through all the regulations and all the screening and all the CFPB doing, enforcement by or regulation by enforcement, we still have this. And while you cannot plan for something of this magnitude, the reality of it is, I go back to my earlier comment, I don't think it would have taken something of this magnitude to put us in this same situation. I just think that because this is so large, it happened very, very quickly and nobody was prepared. But I don't think it was just a one-off situation. I think that problem was systemic from the beginning. And part of it is, while I've worked for non-bank lenders most of my career, the capital requirements of non-bank lenders are nothing like they are on depository lenders. I mean, they're just not. But we do need to come up with some form of maybe like an FDIC type insurance for the non-bank lenders that they purchase into to help secure their process. If they're going to be mortgage servicers, and let's face it, a lot of them do it very, very well. And they protect their portfolios and they keep that portfolio turning like a cash cow. The reality of it is we need to have some mechanism in place to protect the taxpayers to some degree. And so something like an FDIC or what it may look like, I don't know, but it needs to be something like that. We have it with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We have it with banks. So if non-bank lenders are going to play in the deep end of the pool, then we need to have some sort of insurance protection in place as well.
I'd like to thank Joe Murin for joining us today. I hope you had as much fun as we do and did. And Joe, would you like to leave any contact information if someone would like to reach out to you after this?
It's jmurin at jjamfs.com.
All right, we'll get that into the show notes. Joe, hopefully if you like the bathtub gin I'm about to send you, maybe you join us again.
Call me anytime. Anything for you, Brian. You let me know.
We will. We really do appreciate you being here. And I'd like to thank our special guest today, Charles Cain from WFG National Title. Chuck, is there any way you'd like folks watching this, if they want to reach you, do you want to let them know how they can reach you and where they can get a hat like yours too?
Well, this hat came from Festival Arcadian in Lafayette, Louisiana, which I don't know if that will be happening again this year. They may have back stock they'll be happy to sell. But all that being said, yeah, I can be reached at ccain, CCAIN, at WFGNationalTitle.com if somebody wants to shoot me something or tell me why I'm all wet as to my thoughts.
Outstanding. Thanks again, Chuck. And of course, Rick and Kevin, as always, had a blast. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thanks, guys.
And I do apologize, but the battery on my old iPad is running low, and my daughter, who's in first grade, she's homeschooling, and she's got 2 hours of quantum physics to do tonight. So I'm going to cut it down. Mr. Grant, take us home.
Take care.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope you got some good material out of this. We're trying to reach out to the smartest people we know. One of them may be you for a near future show. The times that we're living through are, well, they're difficult to define or describe. But one thing is for certain, we have lots of really smart people in this industry, and they know what needs to be done, and they have the ability to do it. If you're watching this show, you're probably among those numbers. So expect us in future episodes to reach out and find out more about what you can be doing now to ensure the success of your business as we work through this crisis and on into the rest of the year. Until next time, thanks for watching.